Bletchley Park was only the middle of the story. Britain's secret wireless war began somewhere else entirely. Before a codebreaker could touch an Enigma message, somebody had to find the transmission, identify it, copy it accurately, and get it to the right desk. Many important signals never went to Bletchley at all. Some were public broadcasts. Some came from agents in occupied Europe. Others were British transmissions designed to sound German. That is the larger system. Not one secret house in Buckinghamshire, but a chain of ears, wires, paper, translators, transmitters, and decisions. It's to haunt. Picture the beginning of that chain at night. A wireless operator sits in a hut with headphones clamped over both ears. There is no map moving on a screen, no automatic transcription, no clean digital signal. There is static, fading, Morse, call signs, frequency changes, and the possibility that the station being heard will vanish before the message is complete. A pencil moves across a form while the operator keeps one hand near the receiver. A few seconds of weak Morse can mean nothing by itself. The same call sign heard at the same hour on several nights can become a pattern. A sudden burst of traffic can matter even before anyone knows what the messages say. The operator's job is not to understand the whole war. It is to catch one fragment of it without damaging the fragment. A transmission is logged. The time matters. The frequency matters. The call sign matters. The rhythm of the operator can matter. If the message is encrypted, the letters still have to be copied exactly. If it is spoken, the language and wording may reveal something immediately. If several stations hear the same transmitter, direction finding can help locate it. That makes interception a form of intelligence before cryptanalysis even begins. The signal has a location, a schedule, a volume, and a behavior. Those clues travel with the message. Only after that does the famous part begin. Bletchley Park became the symbol because code-breaking produced extraordinary results. But code-breaking had no raw material without interception, and intelligence did not end when a cipher was solved. The real question was always what happened to the signal next. Britain had learned before the Second World War that simply listening could expose military activity that an enemy wanted hidden. At Branston Mere in Lincolnshire, one of the early RAF wireless interception sites, operators were monitoring continental radio traffic years before 1939. GCHQ records that the station became the first RAF-Y station in 1927. Pre-war intercepts later helped confirm that German bomber forces were training again despite the restrictions imposed after the First World War. Even without reading a secret operational order, the British could count call signs, recognize patterns, and build a picture from activity itself. That is the first important correction to the Bletchley myth. A message does not have to be decrypted before it tells you something. When war came, the listening effort expanded. Military Y stations operated around Britain and overseas. The Radio Security Service also drew on amateur radio enthusiasts who were unusually good at pulling weak Morse out of noise. At Hounslow Park, which became fully operational as an intercept station in 1942, those skills were used to collect radio traffic from Northern Europe. The scale was human as much as technical. By the end of the war, GCHQ records around 80 military personnel working on signals intelligence at Branston Mere alone, including many women from the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. They worked around the clock because radio traffic did not respect office hours, and the enemy was trying to make their work harder. At midnight, German frequencies and call signs could change. An operator who had spent hours following one network might suddenly lose it. The next task was to sweep the band, recognize the new signal, and rebuild the thread. Direction-finding stations could compare bearings. Traffic analysts could watch which stations appeared, disappeared, or suddenly became busy. Direction finding was particularly revealing because several listening sites could take bearings on the same transmission. Where those lines converged, the radio network acquired geography. The content might remain encrypted, but a transmitter that had moved from one region to another had already disclosed something about the unit using it. A rise in radio activity might indicate movement even when the words remained unreadable. A familiar call sign could connect a new transmission to a known unit. A weather report sent without strong encryption could reveal conditions over an area where aircraft were expected to operate. Listening at scale meant turning thousands of small observations into continuity. That continuity is what made the next stage possible. Bletchley Park did not sit beside every enemy transmitter. It depended on a distributed network that kept finding the war in the air and feeding it inward. Now follow one encrypted message. A Y station operator hears Morse and writes down groups of apparently meaningless letters. Accuracy is everything. One wrong character can become somebody else's problem miles away. Alongside the text are the details that make the intercept useful. Time, frequency, call sign, and where possible the network or service believed to be transmitting. Early in the war, physical movement was part of the intelligence system. GCHQ records motorbike dispatch riders carrying secret communications from Branston-Mere on an 80-mile journey to Y service headquarters at Seattle. Later, teleprinters accelerated the flow and delivered intercepted material more directly toward the codebreakers. The separation of jobs was deliberate. The listener did not need to know what Bletchley was doing with the message, and the codebreaker did not need to sit beside the aerial that had caught it. Secrecy was maintained by compartmenting the chain, but that also meant every handoff had to be dependable. This is where the image of Bletchley Park changes. The mansion and huts were not a magical place where enemy secrets simply appeared. They were a processing center inside a logistics network. The raw intercept might be sorted by enemy service and cryptographic system. Analysts needed enough traffic to see repeated structures. Codebreakers searched for weaknesses, routines, and probable content. Machines could assist with the enormous search problem, but the process still depended on the material arriving quickly and in sufficient volume. And even before the cipher yielded, the envelope around the message could be intelligence. Imagine two German radio networks that normally transmit at a steady pace. One suddenly becomes crowded with short exchanges. Another changes location according to direction finding. A third falls silent. No sentence has been read, yet the pattern itself suggests that something in the organization has changed. This was traffic analysis, and it matters because war creates behavior before it creates explanation. The Y service therefore did more than act as a microphone for Bletchley. It measured the enemy's radio habits. Operators learned call signs and, in some cases, the individual sending styles behind them.
GCHQ notes that Branston-Mere staff could recognize different types of Luftwaffe activity from these patterns, giving warning and context that radar alone could not always provide.
The volume also mattered. One isolated intercept can be ambiguous. Hundreds of related signals over time reveal routine, hierarchy, and change. When a network that is normally quiet begins transmitting heavily, analysts have a baseline against which the abnormal becomes visible. Then, the decrypted content could be placed on top of that pattern. A solved message was stronger because somebody already knew when it had been sent, from what network, under what radio conditions, and in relation to what other traffic. The chain added context at every stage. But Britain was listening to something else too, something that required no Enigma machine at all. Enemy governments were broadcasting huge quantities of information openly every day, and those broadcasts became a second intelligence stream. BBC monitoring was built around a deceptively simple idea. If foreign governments, armies, and propagandists were speaking to the world, Britain should record what they said. The service was established in 1939 near Evesham. A parliamentary history later noted that 50 monitors were in place just before the war began. By 1942, the organization had grown to about 500 employees, and in 1943 it moved to Caversham Park near Reading. This was listening on a different scale and for a different purpose. A German, Italian, or other foreign broadcast did not arrive as Feitetext. It arrived as speech, music, slogans, news bulletins, and claims. The difficult part was capture, language, translation, comparison, and speed. A statement that sounded like propaganda to an ordinary listener could become evidence when placed beside yesterday's broadcast, another country's version of the same event, or information already held by the government. By mid-1943, historian Laura Calkins found that BBC monitoring was processing about 1.25 million broadcast words a day. That number changes the picture of wartime intelligence. Britain was not only stealing secrets from closed communications, it was industrializing attention to public information. Picture Caversham as a factory whose raw material is speech. One desk is following a foreign news bulletin. Another is handling a different language. A monitor catches the broadcast. A transcript fixes the words on paper. A translator makes them usable to English-speaking readers. And editors decide which passages deserve urgent circulation. The useful clue might be obvious, such as an official announcement. It might also be an omission. A commander who was praised every night has suddenly disappeared from the broadcasts. A place name is repeated more often. Claims about damage change from one bulletin to the next. The intelligence emerges from comparison, not from one dramatic sentence. Inside the monitoring chain, a broadcast had to become text. The text had to be translated where necessary. Editors and specialists selected what mattered. Then summaries and reports could be distributed to the BBC and government users. The key word is not radio. It is transformation. A voice in another country becomes a transcript. The transcript becomes a comparison. The comparison becomes an assessment. And an assessment can alter what officials believe is happening. This is the main turn in the story because it breaks the assumption that intelligence is defined by secrecy. Sometimes the most useful information is intentionally public. Its value comes from systematic collection and context. It also means Britain's wireless war was not one pipeline feeding one destination. BBC monitoring was not simply another Y station, and Caversham was not a branch office of Bletchley. It was a parallel machine for open-source intelligence. That distinction matters. Y stations hunted communications the enemy often wanted private. BBC monitoring captured broadcasts the enemy wanted heard. Both could reveal intentions, pressures, and changes, but through opposite kinds of signal. And there was a third category. In occupied Europe, Britain needed people to transmit information that the enemy desperately wanted to stop. Those signals came from clandestine wireless sets small enough to travel in a suitcase. The Special Operations Executive was created in 1940 to support sabotage, subversion, and resistance in enemy-occupied territory. For an agent or resistance circuit, wireless could collapse the distance between a hidden room in Europe and London. It could also expose that room. Portable sets therefore had to solve two problems at once: communicate far enough to be useful and remain small enough to conceal. The National Army Museum holds a wireless transceiver number 3 MEC-2, commonly known as the B-2, developed in 1942 by Captain John Brown of SOE. It was built into a suitcase so that an agent could move with it without carrying something that obviously looked like military radio equipment. The National Archives preserves records and images of the same clandestine world, including suitcase radio equipment in SOE files. Open the case and the romantic image of espionage becomes hardware, receiver, transmitter, headphones, Morse key, power supply, crystals, aerial wire. Every component creates a practical question. Where can the aerial be hidden? Is there electrical power? How long can the operator stay on air before somebody notices? Has London copied the message correctly? The radio operator was one of the most vulnerable people in a clandestine network because transmitting creates a signal that can be hunted. German direction-finding teams did not need to read the message to know that an illegal station was on the air. That they needed bearings, time, and enough repeated transmissions to narrow the search, so speed became part of survival. A coded message prepared before transmission reduced time on the key. Schedules and frequencies had to be coordinated. Reception from London mattered, because an operator who had to repeat a message spent more time radiating from the same area. A documented case shows how much could depend on one surviving link. In Lyon in 1942, Virginia Hall had built contacts across the resistance. After a Gestapo raid captured a group of SOE and resistance figures, the National Archives records that Hall was left as the only SOE agent at liberty in the area, with a radio able to communicate with London. A suitcase-sized wireless system could become the difference between an isolated network and a network that still had a headquarters. The wireless set also changed what resistance could do. London could receive reports, request clarification, coordinate supply drops, pass instructions, and maintain contact with networks that otherwise depended on couriers crossing borders and checkpoints. This was not the same intelligence chain as the Y stations. Here, Britain was creating the signal from occupied territory, not intercepting an enemy one. Yet the underlying logic was identical. A useful wireless network depends on more than the set. It depends on authentication, procedures, routing, people who trust the message, and a headquarters capable of acting on it. That last point is easy to miss. A warning can cross hundreds of miles through the air and still fail inside an office. That the technical success of transmission does not guarantee the human success of interpretation. Before we reach that problem, Britain made one more move. It stopped using radio only to hear and communicate. It began using the enemy's trust in radio against him. At Crowborough in Sussex, Britain built the offensive end of the wireless system. The transmitter was called Aspidistra. FCDO Services records that the project grew from American high-power transmitter equipment modified into a 600-kilowatt medium-wave system.
Typical transmitters of the period were far less powerful, around 25 to 150 kilowatts. Aspidistra could also shift frequency extraordinarily quickly, a capability that made it useful for deception.
Its arrival was almost a story in itself. The transmitter crossed the Atlantic, but the ship carrying the original aerial was torpedoed, forcing the aerial system to be rebuilt in Britain with Canadian engineering assistance. By 1942, Crowborough had become a place where radio could be treated as a weapon without firing a shell. The engineering mattered because deception had to survive the listener's instinct for authenticity. A fake German station that arrived weekly from the direction of Britain was easier to suspect. A transmitter powerful enough to occupy a familiar part of the dial and agile enough to move rapidly between frequencies could make the illusion harder to dismiss. One use was black propaganda. Soldatensender Calais sounded like a German station for German soldiers. It mixed entertainment and news, using accurate information to build credibility, while framing events to damage confidence and morale. The deception worked because the lie was not constant. Trust required enough truth to make the manipulation believable. That principle is more sophisticated than simple jamming. Jamming tells the enemy that somebody is blocking his signal. Black broadcasting tries to make the enemy listen voluntarily. Aspidistra's engineering created another possibility. If a German station stopped transmitting, the British could exploit the opening. The transmitter's power and rapid retuning made impersonation and intrusion possible on frequencies an enemy audience already recognized.
FCDO Services also describes Operation Dartboard, in which fluent German speakers imitated ground control and passed false instructions to German pilots. When German procedures changed, including the use of female controllers, the British adapted their own voices.
The same radio spectrum that had been mined for clues was now being seeded with false ones. That is the final expansion of the story. Britain's wireless war began with listening, but it matured into control of the information environments. The same medium could reveal an enemy network, carry a resistance report, expose propaganda trends, or inject a false instruction. The signal path had become two-way. And this is why reducing wartime wireless intelligence to Bletchley Park leaves out the mechanism that made the system powerful. The decisive advantage was not one building. It was the ability to move information across several different chains, then convert it from noise into something a person could use. Follow the path one last time. A Y station catches Morse, logs the details, and sends the intercept onward. Bletchley attacks the cipher. Another branch of the British system listens to foreign broadcasts and turns them into translated reports. Somewhere in occupied Europe, an SOE set sends a clandestine message back to Britain. At Crowborough, Aspidistra sends deception in the opposite direction. These activities belong to different organizations and serve different purposes. That is precisely the point. Britain's secret wireless war was bigger than Bletchley Park because Bletchley was one crucial node inside a wider ecology of interception, open source monitoring, clandestine communication, analysis and transmission. Not bigger because Bletchley was unimportant. Bigger because usable intelligence began before the cipher room and continued after it. The codebreakers solved one class of problem inside a system that also had to capture, route, translate, authenticate, compare, and distribute signals. The machine only worked when the handoffs worked. Static had to become characters. Characters had to become text. Text had to become meaning. Meaning had to reach somebody with the authority to act. At every step, information could be delayed, mistranscribed, misread, doubted, or ignored. Technology can reduce distance without eliminating judgment. A radio operator can perform perfectly. A cipher can be broken. A transcript can be accurate. The final failure can still occur when a human being decides whether the information deserves belief. That is why the path of the signal is more revealing than the story of any one institution. It shows where intelligence gains value and where it can lose it. A faint Morse transmission may become an operational warning. A public speech may become an intelligence assessment. A hidden suitcase set may keep a resistance circuit connected to London. A 600 kilowatt transmitter may make a British deception sound as if it belongs inside the enemy's own radio world. Every case ends at the same place, a decision, and that is where the next story begins. In 1942, SOE received a wireless warning from inside its own network, a warning that should have changed what happened next. The signal crossed the distance. The problem was what people in Britain believed when it arrived.
Subscribe to Coded Air for the hidden wireless chain behind Britain's Second World War intelligence, because the most dangerous part of a listening network is what happens when the warning arrives and nobody trusts it.